Okay.
So good afternoon and good evening to this really nice session, a contribution to the GLO conference and a very unprecedented, I should say, conference of 3 days, 24 hours around the globe, conference with really fantastic other speakers. So without any further ado, our session is topics or issues in labor economics, and it will be for 2 hours. Every speaker will have about 20 minutes or so, and some discussion, and then overall discussion at the end. And I will follow the program. So I will start with Professor Guillermina Jasso from New York University and her paper, Do Economists Have a Sense of Justice?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amelie. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. Are you starting to see my screen? And in a minute, it should be, okay, it should be full screen. Excellent. Okay. It's a big honor to be with all of you today to celebrate not only the journal, but in particular Klaus. I am viewing this as a little festschrift. So on now with my paper, and very great honor and pleasure to be with you. I'm going to begin with a summary of the findings for the very good reason that I will probably run out of time, and this way you will already know what the findings are. So this is an empirical study, and what I find is that economists possess a sense of justice. They exercise it in some situations, and the situations that I'm going to look at in particular begins with forming ideas of the just reward, inclusive of being guided by principles of justice, both micro-justice and macro-justice. Economists judge the justice or injustice of actual rewards, and in both operations, they display independence of mind, which is one of the most pervasive findings in this field. Economists seem no different from others, as you see here, on all these principles and some minor things such as expressiveness and framing. So there are two classical themes guiding this talk. Is the sense of justice universal? And is the exercise of the sense of justice deemed appropriate only in certain contexts and not in others? So I'm going to go very, very fast through this setup. The first question, some philosophers say, no, the sense of justice is not universal. Others say, yes. I'm flashing some slides. I'm not going to read them. Rawls, of course, says yes. Justice Scalia. Not everyone said yes, as you saw on that other screen. For example, our friend Freud. The second theme is the exercise of this. Remember, this is different from possessing the sense of justice. Is the exercise of the sense of justice deemed appropriate only in certain contexts and not in others? And some say yes. And the two most important cases are, one, philosophers and theologians who discourage justice discourse about the natural goods and bads, and economists who seem to discourage justice discourse about income. And I think everyone here is familiar with von Hayek. And of course, you see that this was more in the past than now, and that even in the past, there were always notable exceptions. And so this is important to keep in mind. This is not a monolith. Again, I'm going to go very, very fast. These are just slides that show these two positions about the natural goods and bads, Rawls, for example. And this is the famous, famous words of von Hayek. Now, we're doing a scientific study here. Theory posits 3 fairness faculties, which lead to 4 justice personality types. which you're going to see in a minute. Empirical work suggests that most people possess and exercise all three fairness faculties, which you're going to see in a minute. Very few people are bereft of a sense of justice, perhaps confined to specific contexts and specific intellectual disciplines. These are the three fairness faculties. And by the way, this may all seem like different sides of the same coin, and in a way they are, but this is the analytics of the sense of justice. The first faculty enables formation of ideas about what is fair. The second enables assessment about whether an actual situation is just or unjust. And the third enables distinction in certain situations between unjust under-reward and unjust over-reward, as with income, for example. This leads to 4 personality types. Type 0, I won't go through the rest because you can eyeball and you can see what's happening here, but type 0 is very important. The justice oblivious does not possess or exercise any of the justice faculties. And again, now, 2 possible examples of justice obliviousness: philosophers and theologians on the one hand, economists on the other. And in fact, I must tell you that whenever I present any of this work on fairness, anywhere, if there's an economist in the room, that person will instantly say, oh, justice oblivious, that's economists. And so this is important for us to keep in mind as we go on. Okay, so what am I doing in this paper? I'm using modern scientific justice theory to try to assess whether economists possess and exercise the sense of justice. I'm going to be using factorial survey methods, more popularly known as vignettes. Each economist is judging 20 fictitious workers, and I'm estimating all of the justice quantities that are specified in justice theory and that are estimable in this setup, because there are different designs, and in this particular design, we can test for a lot of things, including economists' independence of mind. And then for independence of mind, I have this beautiful slide that shows that a great psychologist, Elaine Hatfield, and a great economist, Milton Friedman, agreed and independently of each other said that justice is in the eye of the beholder. So this is this independence of mind. Now, who's the respondent sample? This is an old study. And I only recently went back to it to analyze it and try to prepare it for publication. This was a conference in December 1991, attended by 45 social scientists. A conference on working women and the economic well-being of women and children. You see the sponsor, you see where it was held, you see who the organizers were, and almost all of the participants were economists. And the organizers, Alice Nakamura, chief among them, decided, let's see what happens with this sample. And so it was her idea to have this research at dinner time with dessert. The program said dessert with vignettes. So when dessert was served, I served the vignette instrument, and you will see some of it. Now, this is all the way justice theory is set up. I'm going to skip all of this because we don't have time, but this is all of the setup. I'm going to be looking at justice for others. There's all these relevant actors going on, and a single person can play different roles. These are the fundamental processes. You can put them together. What we're going to look at today is the observer. These are the economists, forming ideas of the just reward and judging the justice of actual rewards. That's what we're going to look at today. This is another way of looking at it. This is really more for the, this is for the pious. All the ins and outs of how we do it. This is a general map of what we're doing. Now, I've talked about the actual reward. I've talked about the just reward. The justice evaluation is what combines them. And so this is the heart, shall we say, the beating heart that makes everything else possible. And this is the justice evaluation function. J, the assessment that the worker in this case is fairly or unfairly paid varies as the logarithm of the ratio of the actual reward to what the observer thinks is the just reward for that worker. So this just tells you that what I just said. This has some nice properties. So we don't have to look at the properties now. We want to get quickly to where we're going. But this does tie up the underlying theoretical relations. There's an experience justice evaluation that when we actually ask people and they say something, becomes an expressed justice evaluation. And the two need not be the same. And in fact, we find empirically that they differ. And there's this little theta here, which is the expressiveness coefficient. Theta does other things, we're going to ignore them for right now. So in this research design, it turns out it's possible to obtain estimates with good properties. And so there's bells and whistles here. We use a number matching technique in order to obtain these justice evaluations. To the great psychophysicist S.S. Stevens. We get good estimates of theta, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, let's look at the workers. Each respondent is looking at 20 fictitious workers. These workers are each a random combination of characteristics: years of schooling with 8 levels, occupation, 17 occupational titles. There's 2 decks, each with 20 workers, half men, half women, and the 2 decks are constructed so that one deck has the reverse gender of the other. And so this permits doing some additional, very interesting analyses. Each worker is then assigned a hypothetical actual earnings in 11 possible levels. So then this is what a vignette looks like, for example. And then each respondent is asked, and by the way, in this tradition, instructions are always read aloud. This is this multisensorial idea, as well as having them in front of them written down. What we're asking them to do is assign a number that represents their justice assessment for each of the fictitious workers, where 0 represents the point of perfect justice, where negative numbers represent unjust under-reward, where positive numbers represent unjust over-reward, and then they're told and they're given examples about how the closer the number is to 0, the milder the injustice is, and the farther away from 0, the more severe the injustice is. These are the equations that we then use to estimate that expressiveness coefficient theta. Theta then allows us to estimate both the experience, the actual experienced justice evaluation, and then we use it to obtain estimates of the true just reward. The idea here being, since time immemorial, that if you ask people outright, what do you think is the fair wage for this or that person? There's going to be intrusions, things like all sorts of biases, rhetorical biases, etc. So again, to go over the sample, we have 41 respondents received the instrument. Okay, this is at dinner. 1 declined to participate. 1 judged all workers fairly paid on the grounds, and this was written very nicely, whatever is fair. So 44 of the 45 possess and exercise a sense of justice, and 43 of them provided ratings that were analyzed in the classical justice factorial survey design. So these are some examples that I'm going to give you of the results. Incidentally, in this tradition, everything is analyzed separately for each respondent before then combining everything together and doing things like parameter stability tests, et cetera, et cetera. So for the first 5 respondents, our estimates of theta, this expressiveness coefficient, as you can see, vary a lot. And this is what we always find. Some people whisper, some people shout. And this is visible in the way that people choose numbers. on this justice evaluation scale. We also calculate for each person the R squared for their equation. And you can see here that there's a lot of variation, but you're going to see in a minute that in fact, most of the R squareds are high, meaning that for most respondents, these characteristics are being used in an orderly, coherent way to form their judgments. And so this sort of pulls together some of the things I just said. R squared crosses 0.5 between a little above the 14th percentile. So you can see that in fact, and this is a graph, most of the R squareds, one for each respondent. Here we have 43 R squareds. You see that most of them are fairly high. Okay, theta, its fancy name is signature constant, but we can think of it for today at least as the expressiveness coefficient. All the estimates are positive. This means that everybody regards earnings as a good. In general, about 1% of the population regard income variables as a bad. Okay, so economists so far look like everybody else. And this is the quantile function for theta. And again, we expect this huge variation. Okay, and we got it. Now, we then estimate the just reward for each combination of respondent and fictitious worker. Okay, so this is a little fragment. There's 43 respondents, there's 20 workers. So you can see at once how much variation there is. It's this Hatfield-Friedman principle at work. So worker, let's say worker 1, for example, is getting just rewards of 25K, 12.9, 16.8, 18.4, 25, etc. Okay, that's in 1991 dollars. Now we examine the principles of microjustice. This refers to who should get what and why. Okay, and so we're going to get at that via estimating for each respondent a just reward function. We're also interested in the principles of macrojustice, what the distribution should look like. For example, it's inequality. And so again, for that, we're going to look at the respondent-specific distribution of just rewards for the 20 fictitious workers. So this is what the just reward function looks like. And here are some examples of the results. For respondent 1, the base wage is about $20,000. The rate of return to schooling is rather low, 0.0246. And then you see the gender multiplier, which has the interpretation of the just ratio of female to male earnings. Okay? Now, on this slide, there's two very interesting things. One is this variation, which again, people, this is the US, people have their own ideas about everything. But notice in the gender multiplier, and of course, this is a conference on the well-being of women and children, the gender multiplier is already showing large ideas of reparation. For example, respondent 4 with that 5, that women, other things the same, should be earning 5 times as much as men. Okay. All right. So these are fragments. These are just to show you what they look like. These now are the graphs for everybody. And so now you can see what all of these things that we've been discussing look across the sample.
Will you have another
yes.
2 minutes?
Thank you very much. Very good. For macrojustice, we look at these 3 measures of inequality. Again, wide variation. And there again, you see the graphs for them. So independence of mind, and we do a lot of different tests on the person-specific, respondent-specific, just earnings distributions. And again, we find in this particular slide, all but one of the tests are consistent with idiosyncratic ideas. These are these famous homogeneity tests. Okay, so the results are that You've already seen part of this. I'm going to skip it, but the Hatfield treatment principle is very important here. This is a slide with findings from similar studies, merely to show that the economists are no different than anyone else. So the summary of the findings, this is the same slide that you saw at the very beginning. In 1991 already, okay? Although there's self-selection, of course, in this conference, economists possess a sense of justice. They exercise it in this situation. They seem no different from anyone else in this tradition of studies. This is a slide focusing on the gender findings. The summary gender multiplier for 1991 is 1.07, meaning that slightly favoring women overall. You saw the respondent-specific differences, but this is for everyone. So this leads us to, this is the last slide. These economists attending the 1991 conference behaved like other respondents. It is possible, however, that though they possess a sense of justice, they choose carefully when to exercise it. When speaking as economists, when speaking ex cathedra, they may keep matters of money and markets out of reach of justice judgments. And a little coda here. There was a special issue of Journal of Human Resources with papers from this conference published. I did not participate in that. There is not a single mention of any justice word or fairness word, except in one paper by a Canadian legal scholar referring not to what you and I would think of as justice and fairness, but rather to the Canadian legal justice system. All right, and with that, I leave you. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Willie. Wow, that's a lot of information on something I at least do not know much, but thank you. That was an eye-opening, wonderful topic. So if you have questions, please go ahead and ask Willie.
Yeah, my initial question would be, why should economists be different at all from the startup? What is the idea? Because we talk about money, and money cannot be justice. I'm not sure.
That's a wonderful question, and incidentally, it's one that I discussed at length with the organizers of this conference. Basically, there are two things going on. One is the great influence of von Hayek. Secondly, empirically, at that time, there certainly was little mention of justice or fairness in any of the economics literature, except in the formal work, for example, of Ken Arrow, in some of the more policy-oriented work of Amartya Sen. But we also noticed at that time that the economists we knew were hardly ever heard to speak any justice or fairness word. We assumed that at home they might, and certainly given that children are incredibly good at saying it's not fair to the parents, as Justice Scalia says, we presume that they do. But then when they put on their economist attire, we saw little evidence of a willingness to discuss things about justice and fairness. Now, that has changed a lot. This is 1991. But what's important is that even in 1991, even in that climate, you sit them down, you make them think about justice and fairness of earnings, and they're like everybody else.
Wouldn't a classical, I mean, economists at that time just have argued a perfect market is fair?
That's an excellent point. If a market is fair by definition, then you're not going to be judging.
Well, I said a perfect market, not a market in general. Okay, I was a little bit cautious.
No, you're exactly correct. You're exactly correct. But in any case, it would be really, really fascinating and easy to do to look up the scholarly usage, for example, in JSTOR, taking published articles for the last 30 or 40 years in selected economics journals, and simply look at how many times justice or fairness or their cognates are used.
Well, nowadays there are lots of papers, of course, published.
A lot now,
the
exactly.
Whole of behavioral economists. Yeah, I agree with you. In 1991, there was nothing going on like that. So far, I remember. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Can I get a question? Okay, so actually, I was at that conference. I don't remember the survey though.
But the dinner, okay.
I don't remember that either. That was a long time ago. But I do have actually what interested me was the heterogeneity across the individuals. And so you're saying that economists, in a certain sense, are very much like everyone else with respect to social justice. But what about with respect to the heterogeneity across the group? Are we more heterogeneous or less heterogeneous than, say, other groups?
It's a very good question, about the same, which provides evidence in favor of what the psychologists have always thought and what Milton Friedman strongly posited back in 1977. Incidentally, what the conference saw, it was a long conference, you may remember. I think it was Monday through Friday. Not everyone at the conference was there on the Wednesday night. The organizers tonight chose the Wednesday because we thought that would maximize attendance. And on that Wednesday, there were 45 people at dinner. So you may have come before or you may have come after.
I remember it was a good conference though.
Yes, it was indeed. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you. And we will move on now to the second paper by Professor Francine Blau and her co-authored work with Lawrence Kahn, Nikolai Boboshko, and Matthew Comey, all from Cornell University. Sorry, Nikolai is from Cornerstone Research. And the title of the paper is The Impact of Selection into the Labor Force on the Gender Wage Gap.
Thank you so
Fran.
much. Oh, thank you, Amelie. Really delighted to be here and very excited about sharing this panel, and the overall conference is just incredible. Let me do the hard part, which is share my screen, and if that goes well, we should be in good shape. Okay, so is the PowerPoint showing?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, everything's fine.
Good, good. So as Amelie said, I have a number of excellent co-authors on this paper, and I do want to mention one of them. Matthew Comey is on the excellent Cornell graduate student on the job market this year.
Oh.
So, yeah. Okay, let me give you some context and motivation for the paper. As I'm sure many of you know, there's been a substantial decrease in the gender pay gap in the US since the 1980s, since 1980. And here I have some actual data on it from our data set, but you can see the sharp fall from 0.48 log points to 0.18 log points. And this is for a sample that we're going to call of highly attached workers. That is, workers who work full-time and most of the year, 26 weeks or more. Now, on its face, this is very impressive, but the problem arises because women's labor force participation has risen at the same time, and indeed, men's labor force participation has fallen. So, and at the same time, let me also mention both male and female labor force participation has become more positively selected on education. So depending on the selection patterns into the labor force, it is possible that the apparent convergence in the gap is an artifact of selection. This could be the case if the trends are dominated by more highly skilled women coming into the labor force, or alternatively, we might be understating convergence if the men who've been dropping out of the labor force are negatively selected, if the low-wage men are dropping out. So that's kind of our starting point. And what's been done so far, there have been many studies of the gender pay gap that have attempted to account for selection bias, but they use different data and econometric methods, and they focus on different periods. So although the resulting evidence has been mixed, it's difficult to know whether there would be agreement or disagreement across the studies if they were done in a more consistent way. And one particularly influential paper, it's kind of an outlier in the literature, by Mulligan and Rubenstein, actually found that the mean unexplained wage gap, that's the wage gap adjusting for measured characteristics, did not fall between the 1970s and the 1990s. So we were motivated to see whether that would hold up. So what do? We take a single data set. It's the Michigan PSID, Panel Study of Income Dynamics, for a single time period, 1981 to 2015. And we use it to study selection bias, comparing results across the main approaches to adjusting for selection. Now, this includes our main approach, which is a somewhat new approach that we are suggesting here, and we call it probability weighted imputation. And what we do, there are sort of two steps. Firstly, we leverage the longitudinality of the PSID to recover wages for as many respondents as possible. And this builds on earlier work by Derek Neal. And for those who are still without observed wages, we use the employed individuals to estimate the probability of being in each decile of the wage distribution. This is a richer version of an earlier median approach used by Olivetti and Pietrangelo. We also adjust for both female and male selection into the labor force as is appropriate now, given the trends. We compare our results with the major alternatives in the literature. First of all, structural selectivity bias models deriving from the important work of Heckman, and that these are implemented at the mean. And at the median, a newer approach by Arellano and Bonham, which allows selection correction at the median. We also use techniques not as well known as the other, which is called identification at infinity. And basically the idea there is to identify a subpopulation with a very high probability of employment, and thus relatively not as influenced by selection, and use that population to study the gap. And then we use bounding approaches by Blondell and co-authors and others, which endeavor to use the smallest possible amount of assumptions. And our findings are largely robust across these alternative methods. So I'd like to mention some advantages of the approach that we are particularly advocating, probability-weighted imputation. And first of all, it avoids strong identifying assumptions that are required to implement the structural methods, and it produces more stable, robust results than these methods. And I'm going to show you in this work itself the lack of robustness of the structural methods, in this case to functional form assumptions. It yields more precise estimates than bounding. Bounding is admirable because it makes relatively few assumptions, but it gives you a very wide possible range of outcomes. It does not require us to assume positive selection, unlike some earlier work by Bayer and Charles and Neal and Johnson, who were looking at race gaps among men. As I'll explain in a minute, this is not entirely inappropriate to make this assumption when you're looking at entirely male sample, but it doesn't work well for women. And because we impute a whole distribution of wages, we don't have to make any assumptions about the precise value of the imputed wages. What do we find, taking my instructions from Willie, since who knows if I'll get to this by the end? We find large declines in the raw and unexplained gender wage gaps over our period. So basically, adjusting for selection does not remove the finding of convergence. Our results are highly robust across methods. And under our preferred method, we find a substantial decline in the raw median wage gap of 0.378 log points, and also the gap adjusting for measured characteristics. And these are your classic human capital characteristics of experience and education. But of course, as I'm sure you know, substantial wage gaps do remain today. The wage gap has not been eliminated. What is our contribution? I've hinted at what we think it is already. Again, producing results across a consistent data set and time period, leveraging the longitudinality of the PSID to improve wage coverage. And this is important because the more wages that you have information on, the less influence your selection bias correction is going to have. So it won't be at the mercy, if you will, of particular selection bias corrections. But I do want to point out that our results do not hinge on the expansion of the wage sample. And I'll show you that as well. We use the PSID. I'm so excited to be able to say this here. And a big advantage of it is that we have data on actual labor market experience, as my colleague Saul, working with Jacob Menser, showed was very important. And it's further important, not just fundamentally, but because in other work that Larry and I have done, as we've shown, there's been a large decrease in the gender gap in experience over this time period. We correct for male as well as female selection, as earlier studies did not. I mean, earlier in the sense of some of the studies done at the beginning of when economists got interested in this. And again, the predicted wage deciles, I think, are important. And this is because a previous approach that focused on the median only tried to place people out of the labor force either above or below the median, taking artificially high and low values. But if you want to run a regression type analysis, you need more precision than that. And that's what we are able to get with our decile predictions. So let me just say some brief, we have more in a revision of our paper, but a few words about selection. This is very straightforward, derives from Heckman, and that individuals whose offer wage is above the value of their time, an hour of their time in the home, W is greater than W star, will be employed, and individuals whose offer wage is less than the W star will not be employed. And the reason I'm showing this is because you can see the difference between a study that might focus entirely on men, like those wage gap studies I mentioned. For men, it might be reasonable to think that males are out of the labor force because they've received a particularly low wage offer. But for women, you cannot make that assumption. Women could be out because of a low wage offer, but they could be out because they have an exceptionally high value of home time. And thus, the wage, if we could measure it, if they were to enter, could be quite high. So let me move closer to the results by just again saying that we use the PSID. We're focusing on working age individuals, 25 to 54. That's useful here because we can avoid selection due to schooling or retirement, except for the PhD students out there where they may still be in school. And we found that importantly, this Michigan panel PSID data is very similar in its broad trends to the current population survey. So we have confidence in it as a nationally representative sample. So to implement our approach, we construct 4 wage samples. One is, I'm calling sample 1, it's highly attached individuals that I mentioned before. You can see they have, they're full-time, they have 26 weeks of employment. It's a relatively homogeneous sample with respect to labor market commitment, and many analyses of wages in general and the gender gap in particular focus on this sample. We then sweep in additional information from part-timers and people who work part year, and also those who don't have a wage observation now, but do have one in an adjacent survey. And our results are very robust to how we get this additional wage data, looking forward and backward, just forward, or just backwards. Then we impute wages for the sample 3 individuals who don't have them. We use a simple set of covariates, human capital variables, region, race, ethnicity. But our results are robust to other specifications. Then I think in the interest of time, I can't go into detail now, but we do have particular methods, particular approaches to trying to take into account that our predictions might not be exactly right and to adjust for the error in that.
Fran, you have another 5 or 6 minutes or so.
Okay.
Okay.
I think what I'm going to do is first of all show our main results in the form of one figure, and here we see that the unexplained gap, uncorrected for selection, the blue line, and the black line is the unexplained gap. This is adjusted for measure characteristics by the black line. And one interesting thing I'd note is overall adjustment for selection does widen the gap in each year. So the gender pay gap shown in this axis is larger if you adjust for selection. But the decrease in the gap is comparable and indeed a bit larger after adjusting for selection. So then I am going to fast forward to this chart, which gives convergence under alternative selection correction methods. Okay, so let me summarize the findings under alternative methods. Sample 1, remember, was the highly attached sample. Sample 3 includes the nearby waves. We apply selection to each sample. So this is something I do want to point out with our probability weighted imputation. We can apply it directly to sample 1. And when we do that, our results are very similar to our final results. Convergence is shown here. The filled in circles are the raw gap. The open circles are the unexplained gap. And you can see they're all negative. Convergence represents a decrease in the gender pay gap. Our preferred results for sample 3 are here. They're not actually that different from the sample 1 results. And that's our probability weighted imputation. Structural correction, I think there's an interesting pattern here. When we apply the median correction, we get results that are almost identical to our imputed results. But when we apply the results at the mean, we get a huge range. I should have pointed out that these are significance bars. We get a huge range of estimates saying it's not significant and the gap could have increased or decreased. When we look at sample 3, we get convergence both in the median and the mean approaches. So we say the preponderance of evidence supports convergence even in the structural models. And this finding for sample 1 is disconcerting for these models, that functional form could make this much difference. Identification at infinity, we get very similar results. And let me move on to bounding. I'm focusing on the unexplained gap using first order stochastic dominance, and this is the assumption that those who are out of the labor force, their median is no higher than those who are in. It's a minimal assumption that our empirical work actually supports. We have estimates of those medians, and each entry group, their median is lower than the included group. The range we get for bounding is all in this negative area of convergence. Now, a problem with bounding is there's no regression approach that you can use here, but what we did is we cross-classified the data by education and experience to form 4 categories, like low education, low experience, etc., through high education, high experience, and all show convergence in the bounding approach, with the weakest results on for the low education, low experience group. So to conclude, we've studied convergence in the gender pay gap in the US since the 1980s. We suggested a straightforward data-driven approach to selection that addresses some of the issues posed by the other approaches in the literature. We find strong convergence in the unexplained gap, that is the gap even controlling for measured characteristics. If I had a little more time, the point I would make is that women's improvement in their measured characteristics does explain some of the convergence, but a considerable portion of it, major portion of it, is due to improvements for women controlling for measured characteristics compared to men. And we largely confirm our results for our preferred method using a variety of other methods. So thank you very much.
Okay, you still have another minute.
Oh, really? I overreacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran.
Okay.
Great
Question.
work. Thank you. Questions?
Now, Fran, now is it a success that more qualified women are coming to the labor market? If this is part of the story? Maybe before, is this right? Or is this
no, yeah, I don't think it's also an enhancement. it's not due to entry, that part. The full population of women, as well as women we observe in the labor force at any particular time, have upgraded their experience relative to men, and they have actually surpassed men in educational attainment.
Yeah. That's everywhere in the world visible. That
Everywhere in the world.
girls in school are so much better than boys, and so that is a progress in some sense. I mean, it's progress. Yes, that's what we want to see in a way, that the more qualified women in the labor market. So that should be not. I mean, this is one explanation for the success. So there can be
one explanation for the success, no question, is that women have enhanced their human capital relative to men. That's very important. By the way, I was just kind of smiling a little bit because I think that ideally we'd like women and men to be equally educated. We might be causing some problems in the marriage market by having women actually surpass men in education.
I understand the point.
You're getting back into social justice then.
Definitely. I thought I was really let in here, and I'm going to give you all my feelings about, about these trends. Yeah.
All right, so we'll reserve further comments for later, the end of the session. Thank you, Fran, again. And we move on to the third paper by Professor Solomon Polachek from Binghampton University, work co-authored by Jiani from Binghampton University as well. And the title is The Impact of China's One-Child Exemptions on Mating, Work, and the Gender Wage Gap.
Great. Hope everyone can see the slides.
Yes.
Fantastic, thanks. Anyway, for me also, it is a very nice pleasure to be at this wonderful conference and this session. I thank Amelie a lot for putting together great papers. Certainly the first two were pretty good so far. So we'll see about the third. And I also want to congratulate Klaus on 35 years for the Journal of Population Economics. That's very notable. And I also note that I have to congratulate Klaus on a big birthday. And so happy birthday, Klaus.
Tomorrow.
Okay, tomorrow.
That's tomorrow, sorry. I mean, but thank you.
In a couple of hours, anyway.
Yeah, I guess it depends on where one is living right now. Okay, so this paper, actually, I chose to give it for a couple reasons. One, because I knew that Fran was on the panel and cares a lot about the gender wage gap. The other reason is it's actually related to a paper that I did probably about 5-7 years ago in a volume that Klaus helped edited. And so I thought this is a companion piece, and that's the reason I'm presenting this. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the paper. It's motivated actually in part by some of the comments that Fran made about her paper of the shrinking gender wage gap from 1981 to 2015. One of the reasons, of course, I think it's shrinking is that there's been a lot of changes in demographics. One change, of course, in demographics is the decrease in fertility and therefore the changes in division of labor within the home. And in fact, I think division of labor in the home is one of the major explanations for the gender wage gap to begin with. Fran and I might disagree a little bit on this, but I do think that the gender wage gap is to a large extent due to, at least innately, the division of labor in the home. And that has affected then the work lives of husbands and wives, or men and women in general. And that has some aspects of or affects the gender wage gap. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so the question then that I have is why is there a division of labor in the home in the first place? And of course, you can ask, why is it changing? But why is there a division of labor in the home? So that's the key question. Now, some people claim that there's division of labor in the home because women have a comparative advantage in home production. That means they can do home activities better. I don't buy that. I think that men and women are kind of equal. That's my social justice for the second. That I think they're equal in their capacity to do home production. But men and women at least differ in another way. And when I look at the husbands and wives in a marriage, I find something, what I found was very startling, and that is that by and large, husbands were older than wives husbands are older than wives, and at least in the past, they were more educated than, that husbands are more educated than the wives. And so that alone could lead to greater wages of husbands than wives, which could lead to a division of labor in the home. So you don't need comparative advantage in home production, and you don't need discrimination in the labor market. Just the fact that husbands are older and in the past more educated than their wives could lead to a higher wage, which could then lead to division of labor in the home. Now, to illustrate that, I went out and looked at what they actually, it's been done for me because the UN does this, but they look, you can look at the generally the age gap between husbands and wives. And they looked at about 200 countries, and in every single country except San Marino, husbands are on average older than their wives. And this is some data on that by a few countries. And what's interesting is that the age gap is much, much larger in the less developed countries where infant mortality is high and fertility rates or demand for children is relatively high. So this is a chart of the age differences. And if one wants to look at equal ages for husbands and wives, it would be this diagonal line. And in virtually every country is below that diagonal line, meaning that husbands are older than wives. And these red dots are the less developed countries, which is exactly repeating what's on the left of this graph, namely that the age gap is more prevalent in countries where the infant mortality rates are high and the demand for children would be high. Okay. I also have some data, which is a little bit old data, on the education gap between husbands and wives. Now, I realize that now women are more educated than men on average, but that's not necessarily clear within marriages. Now, I don't know what's happening nowadays. If you look at 2022 data on husbands and wives that are married in 2022, but at least in the older data, husbands tended to be more educated than wives, and this is particularly true in China. Okay, so the question then that I really want to ask is, if it's true that division of labor is important, and if that's the case, and if this division of labor is coming about because husbands have a higher wage than their wives, even at the start of marriage, and if they have a higher wage because they're older and perhaps more educated, why are marriages existing such that husbands are older than wives? Why don't you have equality there too in terms of age and education? And in fact, given that women have a higher life expectancy, I might even expect that wives should be older than husbands on average, but that's not the case. So the question then is why? So there is an answer out there, and that answer might be kind of biological in the sense that they're fecundity constraints. So the real question then is what, or the way the logic goes, is that women are relatively younger than their husbands because younger women are preferred the greater the demand for children if fecundity if there are gender differences in fecundity, in other words, if women have limited years of having children, and if going to school puts off having children, and therefore then when they get married, they're older and have a lower fecundity rate. And so that then could lead to these age and educational differences. So in a nutshell, there's a complicated model in the paper of marriage, but in a nutshell, it's very simple. If men are fertile when they're young and old, and women are fertile only when they're young, then that places a higher demand on fertile women that are young, and that will then lead to old men or older men marrying younger women, young men marrying younger women, and a lower demand for older women, and therefore the age gap there'll be a mean age of men somewhere in here, a mean age of married women somewhere in here, and that would lead to an age gap in essence. So that then is essentially the nuts and bolts of kind of the logic that I want to test. Okay, now I'm not the first to think of this. Actually, the first person that I know of that, or the first paper that I know of that looked at fecundity constraints as a reason for the age gap between husbands and wives was a paper by Vela and Collins back in 1990. Aloysius Seo in 1998 did a very similar. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, great. So now these are the papers. And then Gershoni and Lowe have a paper on in vitro fertilization in Israel, which therefore made older women more valuable, and that actually then had an impact on narrowing the husband and wife age gap. So there is kind of a literature on the role of fecundity constraints and the gender or the husband-wife age gap. I'm looking then at the point of this paper is to see if we can test that in a slightly different way and look at then the implication of the changes in the demand for children on division of labor in the home, and then see what then the implications are with respect to the gender wage gap. So what I want to do in this paper with my co-author, Jenny Gao, who I should mention, is to look at an exogenous change in the demand for children, which is coming about by the one-child exceptions. So we all know that in China, they had a one-child policy, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the one-child policy has gotten a number of exceptions, and those exceptions led to an increase in the demand for children. So if there's an increase in the demand for children, that should affect the marriage market, and I'm going to claim that it increases the age gap and the education gap between husbands and wives, which then exacerbates the division of labor and causes a bigger gender wage gap, and that's the point of the paper. I hope that makes sense. Okay, to preview the findings in case I don't get finished, is that the two-child policy widened the gender age gap by 0.4 years, or about 25%. It expanded the probability that the husband will be more educated than the wife by 4.5%. That led to the difference in husband and wife work days per month to increase by 31%, and the hours per day, the difference to increase by 33%. And that led to a 30% increase in the gender pay gap, given this two-child or one-child exception policy. So those are the results. Okay, so having said that, let me quickly go through China's fertility policy. Pre-1970, with Chairman Mao, they were pro-natalist. Then Chairman Mao decided that they were having too many children and had an informal policy, or an informal one-child policy. Then in 1980, it was formalized as a one-child policy, but beginning in 1982, there were one-child exceptions. And there were various kinds of one-child exceptions, and they varied by province and also by some characteristics of the couple. So if the couple was what they call a rural couple or rural hukou and only had one girl, they were allowed to have a second child in some provinces. If they were a rural hukou and one of the spouses was an only child, they were allowed to have a second child in some of the provinces. And later on, if there were either a rural or urban couple and both spouses were only children, then they were allowed to have second or additional children, i.e. a second child. So there's some variation. There's some variation, and I'll talk about in these policies, both over time and across provinces. And this is kind of a map or a time map of how the one-child exceptions increased over a period of time and spatially as well, geographically. Okay, so we have data, and I'll quickly do this on characteristics of people or families in China using the China Family Panel Study. That gives us data on where they live, essentially whether they're rural or urban, their ages, whether they're only children, and data on their own children. And then we used the regulation documents written in Chinese to get at which provinces in China passed which one-child exceptions at different years, and that's how we came up with this map. Okay, so the first thing that we did is to try to prove that this one-child exception policy was essentially exogenous, that is independent of people's prior fertility decisions. So that is, we wanted to be able to use this two-child law, or this one-child exception, you might want to call it, as an exogenous change that occurred. So we looked at the regression where you have the policy of this that apply to these particular families, and that depends on whether or not the family was an only child or whether they were not an only child, and it depended upon which province they lived in. We found that it turns out that their fertility rates before the law had no impact on whether that province passed or did not pass the law. And so that's because these coefficients here are essentially insignificant. So this delta coefficient is insignificant, i.e. Passing of that is the number of children that they had before the policy had no effect on the law. We did this also with another variable, which is a measure of their desired fertility as opposed to their actual fertility, and essentially desired fertility of the husbands or desired fertility of the wife had no impact, no significance here, no impact on whether the province passed the law. We did another exogeneity test, which is to look at, although this might not be as powerful because we did it only by provinces, so we have 23 provinces, whether that is what we looked at is the degree to which, or the proportion of only what we call only childs in that province. So provinces that had, if you were an only child, that then you could have gotten the exemption. And so we thought that maybe if a province had a lot of only children, then that would have caused them to pass the exemption, and we do not find that. And we don't find a variable of the proportion of boys versus girls in the province to have any effect either. So essentially any kind of fertility, infanticide did not cause the province to pass a law about the exemption. So we can treat the exemption, that is the one-child exemption, as basically an exogenous variable. So then
you have another 4 minutes.
Okay, so then we look at proof of treatment, and that is, did the two-child law or the one-child exemption law actually increase fertility? And indeed, we find that it did increase fertility. And so these coefficients over here, which is a Poisson regression on number of children, show that and what's in brackets, it showed that on average, that the law increased fertility by about 1/3 of a child, or increased the probability of having a second child in a logit regression by about 20%. So the law had an effect. So given that the law had an effect, we can then ask, did this law, which increased the demand for children, did it affect the age gap and the education gap between husbands and wives? So the dependent variable is the age gap between husbands and wives, and of course the independent variable is going to be the impact of the law on on this age gaps. So we're interested in this delta coefficient to see if, in fact, those people that were affected by the policy increased the age gap essentially when they got married. That is, did those newlyweds, was the age gap greater for the newlywed husbands and wives compared to those that got married before the policy change? And in fact, it's about 0.4, 0.5 years bigger. Now, that's actually, to me, a very interesting result. And the reason it's an interesting result is related to Fran's work a little bit, because what she's finding, what other people have found, is that that men and women are becoming more alike, and they're getting more alike in terms of wages, but they're also getting more alike in terms of a lot of characteristics. And the age gap over time is narrowing between husbands and wives. There's been a cycle in what age you get married, but the gap has been narrowing, certainly in the US and Canada. So finding that the gap has widened is bucking the trend. And that to me is kind of interesting. So the first finding is that the age gap widened. And you can look at this in a graph. This shows the age gap widening. And then we can do a parallel trend test, which I'm not going to go through, but basically the residuals prior to the law change is 0. And then after the law change is not for the people that are affected by the law. Then what we did is we looked at spousal levels of education. Now, these results are not quite as strong, but we find that what happened is post-law, the educational gap actually widened too. So again, the women are getting more educated relative to men, but here we're finding that the law of increasing the demand for children exogenously actually widens the educational gap. And you can look at this widening of the educational gap would be this point right over here. And as is the case, the educational gap is declining, and it's declining afterwards, but there's still a gap. And what's interesting in this case of the age, it's declining, the age gap is declining, but then after the law, it actually holds steady and it doesn't decline. So there is an impact of education, there's an impact of the two-child law on age gaps and education gaps between husbands and wives. Okay. So it turns out that these effects are heterogeneous. The higher the demand for children, the bigger the effect. I'm not going to have time to go through that. And it turns out that the younger the age at marriage, usually the higher the demand for children and the bigger the effect. So the effects on both age and education gaps between husbands and wives are bigger the higher the demand for children, at least in this data set. Okay, now for the division of labor. So it turns out then that you can then look at the impact of this law. That is, you can look at the impact of this two-child policy on the work time difference between husbands and wives. And so it turns out that the work time difference between husbands and wives in China was about 5.5 days. And what happens is that after passing the law, that increases by 1.7 days per month, or about 1 hour per day, where the average number of hours of work difference is about 3. So you get about a 33% increase in this division of labor, in essence, which is interesting because that also bucks the trend, because basically there should be convergence and now there's divergence. And then in terms of wages, the wage gap between husbands and wives in China for this data set was about 571. And if you look at the unadjusted wage gap, then that the impact of the policy on the unadjusted wage gap is about 170. And if you look at if you adjust for age and education and age squared and so on, that gap widens to 270, or in essence, that you get about a 33% increase in the gender wage gap because of the law. So what's the summary? What do we find? We find that there exists a theory of the impact of fecundity differences by gender, and that leads to husbands being older and more educated than their wives, and that the husband-wife age and school differences are bigger, the bigger the demand for children. So what China did is they passed a two-child policy. And this two-child policy exogenously increased the demand for children, which widened the husband-wife age gap by 0.4 years. It raised the probability that a husband's education exceeds his wife's by 4.5%. That led to a 32% increase in the gap in work behavior and a 30% increase in the wage gap. So that is interesting about this is when we're seeing a convergence throughout the world, this policy led to a divergence in the factors which are making men and women more similar. So let me thank you for the opportunity to present this. Again, let me congratulate Klaus on 35 years as editor of the journal Population Economics, and happy birthday tomorrow, Klaus.
Thank you, Saul. Right on time. Fascinating results. I wouldn't have believed it, but yeah, very interesting. If you can extend and look at other variations, those who had the exceptions and they could have even more children. How did this happen? I don't know if this is into the data set officially, but
yeah,
there are also rumors, many rumors that there are children that officially do not exist because parents wanted to keep them and they hid them when the authorities passed by. So they have the children, but the children are,
Yeah, that's a good point, Amelie. And also the reason I think this is interesting because it counters the previous paper that we had in the Klaus's volume. And there, the one-child policy decreased exogenously the demand for children, and we saw a convergence in the age and education gaps. So men and women, the gap in age got smaller there, and here they're getting bigger. And that's what made, to me, the thing interesting, or the finding interesting.
Yeah, you seem to find that the age gap is rising. Now, well, if this is caused by demand for children, then I'm a bit confused because I thought the demand for kids would go down. Yes, at least in the first stages of development. Recently, in Western countries, the demand for children went up slowly. A little bit, so to speak. At least that's what some people find.
Right. The demand for children is definitely going down. So you see a decline in fertility rates across the whole last 150 years. But what's interesting is in China, when they passed these two-child exceptions, that was an exogenous increase in the demand for children. And so we're getting these results just from that exogenous increase, or the families that are affected by the exogenous increase, comparing them to those that are not affected by the exogenous increase. So you're getting a decline in fertility for those not affected and an increase in fertility for those affected. And it's those people that are affected by the law that created, those people are the ones that have a bigger age gap.
Okay, so my misunderstanding was you're finding for China. Yes, I mean there the situation is different. Okay, this is not a general.
No, it's not general. But what is general is the importance of division of labor in the home and what's causing it. So when I did some of my early work, I mean, what motivated it is the fact that the gender wage gap for single, never been married people were relatively small compared to the married one spouse present. And the largest gender wage gap was the married one spouse present families with a lot of children that were widely spaced out. And so that led to differences in lifetime labor force participation between men and women, causing differences in investments in human capital, which therefore caused a gender wage gap. And so this then always puzzled me is, well, why is there a division of labor in the home? And it dawned on me that that's because even without discrimination, husbands have a higher potential wage. Now, with discrimination, they have a super high potential wage and can cause more division of labor. But even without discrimination, if the husband is older than the wife and more educated than the wife, then at the start of the marriage, then it makes sense for the husband to specialize.
Oh, could I make a quick comment on that? I think you're being a little too global in the sense that if the family implementing the traditional division of labor that they could have for a variety of reasons wants the husband to be the breadwinner, then he would be older and better educated. I mean, I think you're trying to be, to me, a bit too fundamental here. I think these are very good results, but you don't necessarily start with zero. People are responding to anticipated and desired gender roles as well. And let me just make a couple of other comments. Just now education is, first of all, it's getting more highly correlated within the family here, husbands and wives. But we do have a substantial portion of families now, minority, where the wife is better educated than the husband, or else they wouldn't all be married. I did not actually know that the age difference in marriage is decreased in the US. I have not seen that, but maybe you have.
It actually has decreased for the last like 70 years.
Well, I haven't seen it in the raw like statistics, age at first marriage.
I have a graph in the paper.
Okay. Okay, well, you know, I'll take your word for it. And finally, just if you present it again, I found it very confusing because you cited a 2010 data set as your source of data, and I don't know where you're getting all this before and after stuff.
Oh, because it's a panel data set. So you actually have these people from over the time, so you can actually know what their fertility rates and so on were.
Okay, you might mention that.
No.
Another question? Okay, so now we move on to the last paper of the session. This is by me and my co-authors from Oslo, Astri, Syse, and Marianne Tønnessen. And the title is Goodbye Norway, Testing Neoclassical versus Other Theories of, it should be labor emigration. So let's see how I do the share screen. I think this is it. You see anything?
Yeah. We see why Norway.
Okay. So Klaus, would you be kind to keep track of my talk? You know, maybe give me 5 minutes before, like 15 minutes.
Yeah, I tell you 5 minutes before.
Thank you. Okay, so we talked about that. Emigration or out-migration of the first generation immigrants, this is what we will discuss here. Actually, emigration from the host country, either to return back home or to move onwards to a third country, is a relative more recent phenomenon of the late 20th century. This is in contrast to the 19th century, early 20th century, where migration was perceived and de facto was shown to be a one-time move in a permanent framework. And but research on return migration, especially, started in the late 70s. Especially after the first oil crisis, in relation with the guest worker schemes, especially in Europe, where people had to return. And studies overall show that there is variation in the percentage of the immigrants who return. Most immigrants return within the first 5 years since arrival. And return rates are between 20 and 75%. Research on onward movers actually started in the 90s as people could, or researchers could identify onward movers, and as more and more good data became available to document this type of moves. And research shows, again, overall that somewhere between 20 and 66% of immigrants or first-generation immigrants tend to leave the host country and move on to a third new host country. An interesting study by Chalar et al. Shows that actually in the US, about 15% of the high-skilled immigrants are onward or transit migrants. To this day, there is no one unified theory to explain these kinds of migration, and empirical studies, of course, are as good as the data they analyze, which are often inadequate to capture immigration. Just superficially now, I will mention the economic theories on labor migration. And these are the theories that at the end of the paper, which is still in the very beginning, it will be possible to test all these theories. So I start with a neoclassical theory of economics, both micro and micro. The main idea of neoclassical is that economics is the driving force of migration. Wage differentials between countries or locations or counties is the essential impetus, the essential reason why people move. And at the micro level is the individual who performs a cost-benefit analysis and moves permanently to another location. More recent research, I should acknowledge, Dustman and Gorlach, show that actually you can have the neoclassical system with all the assumptions. And if you, as they formulate the model, they show that it's possible to have temporary migration as well. Then we have the new economics of labor migration in the 80s by Stark and Bloom. And we have labor market segmentation by Piore, mostly related to the guest worker schemes. And we also have the Roy model of different income distributions among countries. Borjas brought that to the fore, and that model explains self-selection. And finally, we can also use the gravity model and adaptation of the Newton's law of gravity to the urban geography. So for now, I will look at neoclassical economics, the micro part, and the new economics of labor migration. Again, the basic assumptions are that the individual is an income maximizer. Under perfect information, the individual performs cost-benefit analysis. Earnings differentials are necessary and sufficient. And the individual goes abroad, stays abroad, and never remits. The underlying assumption is that economic agents move to areas of high earnings where human capital is rewarded, of course, subject to transferability. There is no theoretical prediction of this theory for return to the home country, unless, of course, things change and suddenly there are high earnings differentials. Only wage differentials will justify the move. Return results from mistakes, usually in the initial migration decision. So the theory would, as a corollary, would predict that there would be a negative selection among the returnees. So we expect that the returnees are probably unemployed, they're poor, they haven't done well in the new country, and maybe also they are negatively selected in unobservables like their ability or fortitude to stay abroad and cope with new situations, etc. Human capital theory goes very well with neoclassical economics because human capital is the main idea. It's investment in human capital, why people move. Human capital theory is really nifty because predicts the selection, who is more likely to move. That's again for the initial move out of the home country. But the theory has no predictions about the characteristics of the immigrants who return or repeat, circulate, or move onwards. We could make a case that because that when immigrants move onwards to a third country, they do that because there are wage differentials. And so in that sense, the theory shares commonalities with the initial migration, and income maximization principles apply. The new economics of labor migration is rather in an opposite end. Migration here is envisioned as a temporary scheme where the return is pre-planned. Is the planning and the decision to migrate is by the family, the household, and not the individual. The family decides who's going abroad and where and for how long, in order for these people to earn money and come back and help the family and the household to cope with market inefficiencies and risks in the country. So return is right up front expected, and circular movements are possible. Income differentials are not necessary so long as people, it's like target savers. They go abroad, they get the money that they need, and then they return, and they always return as winners. While they're abroad, they also remit. So returnees are positively selected with respect to earnings, and they're negatively selected with respect to work effort. So they're only return where they're unemployed. Human capital is irrelevant, but what is important is the status and the prestige of the Stark also advanced this nice idea of the notion of relative deprivation and how important it is for the family and the household back home to be better off, not only in absolute terms of their income, but also in relative terms with respect to the others, which eventually justifies a further move in order to get more money, because it's always the relative thing that matters. All right, so this is from a continuation from my paper with Doug from 2 years ago, 20 years ago. Here we're trying to sketch what are the predictions of the theory, both theories, on these theoretical variables. And as you see, some are common, like the employed people would be less likely to return because they need to stay and earn money. But the unemployed would be more likely to return. Those who achieve high earnings and wealth are less likely to return according to neoclassical economics, but they are more likely to return under the new economics of labor migration. As you see, human capital is irrelevant for Stark's theory. Attachments to the country are important for neoclassical economics. The more attached people are in the country, like they have citizenship or they buy a house or they have the family in the new country, the less likely they are to return. And yeah, so but then this is our new thing. Now we're trying to add the onward migration, and speculate and go back and go into the psyche of the theory and see how would the theory envision, according to the hypothesis, the movement into a third country. And I hope that this will stay, but it's possible that some of the signs, 0 means no effect at all. Plus means they're more likely to move to another country, and a minus means no, means that they stay. And here we add a few more demographics like age and gender and some public transfers. We do that because of the data set we have, and we try to capture everything as best we can. So this paper actually contrasts these two theories for now, and see which one best describes the exit of immigrants from Norway. So we have longitudinal data, and we ask if immigrants are different than stayers, if returnees are different than the onward movers, and especially if the Nordic immigrants in Norway are different than other immigrants. So why Norway? Well, the first reason is that we got the big grant and the country is eager to know, they really want to know about the selection of their immigrants who leave the country and why they leave and who is leaving. But Norway is also a very developed, high income country in Europe, although not in the EU. They discovered oil in the late 60s, and since the 80s, oil contributed significantly to the economic growth of Norway and the financing of the welfare state. And since then, they have been attracting a lot of immigrants. It started with Nordic immigrants, but they also had guest worker schemes going on, and they received many labor immigrants. Another advantage is that Norway has registers, which means that they have a file on everybody in Norway, everybody who is born, everybody who is entering the country, and everybody who is exiting the country has to deregister. So they have information about basic characteristics on everybody. And we can use this amazing information to see who is exiting actually the country. So we're staying in the 21st century. We endeavor to look at from 2000 to 2020, first generation immigrants, age 20 to 65. This is some selection we have that they arrived in Norway in 1990 or after, because the laws changed, and before that it's not clear really who went and for what. We focus on labor migrants or Nordic migrants who emigrated from 2015 to 2020. And in person years observations, we end up with almost 1.5 million immigrants, of which 300, a little bit more than 300 observations are Nordics. So 21%, a very good percentage are Nordics. And if you separate immigrants into stayers and movers and returnees, we see that among stayers, 19% are Nordics. Among returnees, we have 44% being Nordic. So we see that Nordics really return a lot, more than others. And among onward movers, 19% are Nordics. Although overall onward movers are only 1% of the sample. So most people stay, a few return, fewer move onwards, but still there are enough people for the country to be concerned, especially a country that provides free education and free healthcare and welfare and all these things. So we employ event history analysis, multinomial logic. Dependent variable is the probability to stay, return, or move onwards. We include all these theoretical variables. We also include
Amelie, 5 minutes, about 5 minutes left.
Yes. So these are the results I have. And this is for return versus stay and move on versus stay for both non-Nordic and Nordic immigrants. And this is quite busy. You just see the variables we have here. And let me go over that. So for the non-Nordics, we find that older age deters return. And this is not according to the new economics. Males and married people are more likely to return, but are less likely to return when they are divorced or they have children. Homeowners and citizens are less likely to return, according to neoclassical economics. Those who are less than 5 years in Norway are also more likely to return, according to neoclassical economics. Here we have a puzzle. I put some question marks about education. It's interesting that those who have post-education, post-university education, are more likely to return.
Okay.
Higher earnings increase probability to return. This is against neoclassical economics, but goes in line with new economics. And receiving public transfers and unemployment benefits increases return probabilities, as neoclassical economics will predict, but social assistance decreases return. And this is what we found about the Nordics, and it's not really the same. So older age is the same. Having children is a little bit the same. Home ownership is, the same idea. And here since migration, the education still is a puzzle. Why we find that the high school educated are less likely to return. Earnings is another puzzle. We find that there's zero, so there's no significance on the earnings variable, although the, neoclassical economics would say no return, and the new economics would say they do return, but we don't find that among the Nordics. Receiving public transfers and unemployment benefits increases return, and move on. For non-Nordics, some results are in accordance with the neoclassical economics, others are not, and we have differences again with the Nordics. So this is something we will do, but I haven't done yet, the last binomial. So as a conclusion, and again, this is preliminary results, there's no consistency. The neoclassical economics does not apply to cannot explain every result we found. And the new economics of labor migration cannot explain every result either. Some are easy to explain, and we're happy for that. And some we have to think about harder, and especially think about the onward moves and how we can incorporate these theories and test them and see if these theories are still applicable in the 21st century, and if they're still applicable in a very high developed, high income country, or not, or and what are the consequences of applying theories that do not exist or do not represent the reality of current migrations. So I think I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Questions?
You are the chair. Okay.
Saul?
Well, I think the topic is really fascinating and interesting, and the work is very appropriate because I think it's really kind of understudied, both in terms of what you're looking at is geographic kind of migration, but the other area that's I think related is just mobility in general, including job mobility. And what always struck me is that in looking at job mobility research, you get some of the same patterns of higher probability of moving when you're young to a new job or new company, and it tapers off. But what people really haven't looked at is how long it takes to go from one job to another, or from one move for geographic migration to another. And you're looking at essentially one move to another, either return migration or an onward migration. And I think you're looking at it in terms of the probability of moving onward or the probability of returning in this kind of a logit type framework. I was wondering, the other way to kind of look at this perhaps is to see what factors affect how long it takes for someone to move onward from their first move or to return from their first move. And I wonder if one can get any hints as to which theory is correct by, instead of looking at the probability of return migration or looking at the probability of onward migration, look at how long it takes to either return migrate or to onward migrate, realizing that not everyone does that.
Yes, thank you. Actually, we can do that. We have this information. We know exactly when people arrive, and we know their characteristics upon arrival. We know, their job. We know how much they earn, things like that, and then we know the first time they decided to move. For now, we only look at self-reported deregistrations. There is a little bit of discrepancy with authorities, and we'll check that as well, because some people might not deregister, but within a year, the authorities catch up on that, and then they try to adjust the records. But that's a great point to see how long it takes for them. And we also want to look at more nationalities, maybe more people, different people, like maybe from Africa. I don't know if we can fine tune it to each country, but maybe areas. We can see areas, people who are coming from Asia, or people from, I don't know, Latin America, for example, or North America, and see how they behave, if they behave differently.
Just
Yes.
a quick comment, and it is just really fascinating and very complicated. I wonder if there's a heterogeneity there that, adding to the complication, you could get a handle on, that some people do come for neoclassical reasons, to maximize return and move permanently, and other people are coming as part of a family plan. And by the way, that may be a new way to look at it, but anecdotally, that was very big in earlier waves of migration to the United States, around the turn of the 1900s. So I wonder if you could, and maybe you're touching on it by these geographic areas, if you could zero in on where the different motivations are paramount. I mean, as people have talked about refugees, are permanent in the sense that they can't go home, and they might be a group that you could look at. Of course, they could move on to another country, I guess, but if there's anything like that, you could target.
So right now, the results I showed you are based on pure labor migrants. So there is a question, why did you arrive? And they say, I came for labor reasons, I came for family, and I came as a refugee or something like that. And we separated the labor people because the theories are more clear-cut on that. We might later or in another paper look at others, but I don't know if people arrive for family reunification, how the theories will apply. Or
Right. I meant within your group, which I didn't realize excluded refugees. That's perfectly legitimate. If there's a subset that's operating with one set of goals and another target migrants, that's what I meant by family, who are operating with a different set of goals. And if there was any variables you could find to distinguish them, and I can't really suggest what they'd be, but
yeah, we have to look at that. And I think I'm just thinking one would be if they arrive with family together, because that we would know that if they're married and have their children. That indicates a little different type of migration or not, or yeah, I have a lot of information and we will look more into that. What I don't have to test is none of, like social things like, networks. I don't have that, this come only from questionnaires and, not from administrative data. I have no religion, I have no, things like that.
Do you have relatives back in the home country?
No, they don't ask.
The reason I ask that is because in geographic migration within the U.S., a couple of variables are relatively important. Age is one, but the other one is young children and relatives. In the U.S., having kids in school sometimes deters geographic migration, but the other big deterrent is having relatives in the same area that you live in. So if one moves away, often one might move back for relatives. Certainly in the US, older people often move to where their children are. That's kind of like moving back to where one's relatives are.
Well, we might speculate and create a different category because we know if they're married, we know marital status, and we can link them to their wife. If they have one, in Norway, we can find it, and kids. But if we don't have them in Norway and the people said they're married, we might assume they're married back home. Maybe, under some assumptions. Yeah, that's the best we can have. You cannot have everything with data, at least.
Do you have do you have remittance data too?
No.
Oh, okay. Because that might be some indication of their ties to home country.
Yeah.
Amelie, I think you made the point a little bit earlier about how the data do not include information on co-nationals or co-religionists, etc. If that's correct, wouldn't it be possible to get secondary sources, other sources, and then match to where they live? So, for example, if you learn that there's an association of Presbyterians or an association of, Jewish people, et cetera, that might be one way to get into that.
Yeah, excellent point. Yes, I think we can do that. We can see where they live and calculate the percentage of other co-ethnics in that area. Yeah.
In fact, in towns or cities of a certain size, there's tourism bureaus and chambers of commerce, etc. And it's easy to find all of that information in one place. There's
Thank you
also
so much. I never thought about that, going to a tourism bureau. Okay.
Norway also has some marvelous domestic TV and film making, and looking, for example, at production credits, you can see the people who work on editing and videography and catering, etc., and you can find names that are obviously not native, but that gives you some sense of that climate.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Officially, the time is up. Next is a break. But I want to thank you again. I've learned a lot today. Thank you all. Thank you, Klaus, for all the contributions to the field for so many years. Thank you for the journal that you single-handedly actually started 35 years ago as a young 35-year-old. Wow. Okay. And I hear it's doing better and better, has higher impact factor this year, and very, very interesting and timely papers. And yeah, it's good to see you all. It's been a long time. We all went through a lot with the pandemic, some of us more than others, but it's good to come back and see you, and eventually also in person.
And thank you so much for organizing it. I also learned an enormous amount, and I look forward to keeping up with everyone in the session. And Klaus, warmest congratulations. And as I said, we can all think of this as a little festschrift for you.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure when Amelie came back and said, well, this is my group. I said, oh, fantastic. That's I could not have selected better. So it's wonderful to have seen you now and following your still very interesting work. And yeah, we will stay in touch. And maybe I should now officially stop recording the session.
Oh.